On November 14, 2010, at 3:15 p.m., a Mayon County, North Carolina emergency dispatcher received a call that would soon become the start of one of the most convoluted criminal investigations in the region. A group of teenagers who illegally trespassed on an abandoned sawmill near the Nantahala River found the man. He sat in the corner of a ruined hall, clutching a rusty piece of chain in his hands. His clothes were reduced to dirty rags, and his body was covered with deep cuts and burns. But the most terrifying thing was his face. The man's eyes had been burned away with an unknown chemical, turning his eye sockets into one large red and black wound. He couldn't see his saviors, but when he heard the sound of footsteps, he began to shout the same name over and over again until his voice was hoarse. It was William Taylor, a tourist who disappeared without a trace along with his wife Mary exactly 32 days ago. His return from the darkness of the forest brought no answers, only new, even more terrible questions. On October 12, 2010, at 8:40 a.m., a dark blue Jeep Cherokee pulled off Highway 64 into the gravel parking lot of Winding Sturgap Pass. Located in the heart of North Carolina's Nantahala National Forest, this spot is often a starting point for those seeking solitude amid the Appalachian wilderness. Two people got out of the car. 29-year-old William Taylor and his wife, 27-year-old Mary Taylor. They looked like a typical couple who decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. High-quality hiking equipment, new hiking boots, and self-confidence written on their faces. None of the random drivers passing by that foggy morning could have known that the Jeep would remain there for weeks, slowly becoming covered in fallen leaves and road dust. According to the plan Mary had emailed her mother 2 days before their departure, their route was to be demanding but perfectly manageable for prepared hikers. They planned to hike 50 kilometers north along the Appalachian Trail and reach the Nantahala Recreation Center in exactly 4 days. In Mary's message, she detailed the accommodations and checkpoints. She promised to contact them on the evening of October 16th as soon as they reached a cell phone coverage area. This message was Mary Taylor's last confirmed contact with the outside world. That same day, around 2 p.m., a group of tourists from Florida stopped to rest at the foot of the Wobbled Observation Tower. According to statements they later gave to sheriff's deputies, their attention was drawn to a couple standing slightly to the side of the trail. One of the witnesses, a 50-year-old man, noted in the report that there was a tense conversation between the man and the woman. They did not shout, but their gestures were sharp and tense. The woman, later identified as Mary Taylor, appeared nervous and kept looking back toward the path she had taken. As soon as the couple realized they were being watched by bystanders, they immediately fell silent, put on their backpacks, and quickly set off into the forest without even greeting each other, which is unusual for the culture on the Appalachian Trail. This was the last time William and Mary were seen alive. October 16th passed in silence. On October 17th, Mary's mother's phone was silent. When, by the evening of October 18th, the daughter had still not made contact, the Nantahala Center administration confirmed that no one with that name had registered at the finish line. Parents raised the alarm. On October 19th, the 5th day after the last contact, the Mayon County Sheriff's Office announced the launch of a search and rescue operation. The scale of the search was unprecedented for this time of year. More than 60 volunteers, professional rescuers, and search and rescue units combed kilometer after kilometer of difficult mountain terrain. A state highway patrol helicopter took to the air, its pilots trying to spot even the slightest movement through the thick carpet of autumn forest. The search area was focused around Mount Silerbalt and tourist huts along the trail, where the couple could seek shelter from bad weather. But the forest was silent. No signs of fires, no items left behind, no responses to calls over loudspeakers. The breakthrough came on the 7th day of the search, on October 21st. One of the search groups working in a difficult-to-access sector 5 kilometers east of the official trail reported a discovery by radio. A hiking backpack was found in the dense undergrowth among the rhododendron bushes. It belonged to Mary Taylor. The circumstances surrounding the discovery of the backpack immediately raised concerns among investigators. He was not abandoned in panic. He was not lying on the ground, as happens when a tourist throws off a burden to escape from danger, or getting injured. The backpack stood upright, leaning against the trunk of an old oak tree, as if someone had carefully placed it there, planning to return soon. Rescuers noted that the zippers were fully fastened. Inside, everything was arranged with pedantic precision. Spare clothes were rolled up, and food was packed in airtight bags. The wallet, with documents and money was in the inside pocket. However, a detailed inventory of the contents revealed appalling deficiencies. The backpack was missing a sleeping bag that was attached to the bottom, and a personal first aid kit that Mary, according to her mother, never took out of the top flap because of her chronic migraines. Why did the woman leave warm clothes and food but take her sleeping bag and medicines, walking away in an unknown direction in the middle of the wild forest? This question hung in the air. The situation deteriorated rapidly in the evening of the same day. The temperature dropped below freezing, and an ice storm broke out over the Nantahala Mountains. Rain and sleet turned the slopes into an ice rink, making further work by the search groups deadly dangerous. Streams of water and mud washed away any potential traces around the tree where the backpack was found. Dog handlers reported that the animals were unable to follow the trail due to weather conditions. 2 weeks later, after any reasonable time to survive in such conditions had passed, the sheriff made the difficult decision to end the search. The helicopters returned to base. The volunteers went home. The dark blue Jeep was towed from the Winding Stair Gap parking lot to the police holding lot as evidence. The case of William and Mary Taylor was officially reclassified as a missing persons case. The folders containing the documents were placed on a shelf in the archives, but there were whispers among investigators that this was no ordinary accident. The forest took them, but left a strange, ominous sign in the form of a lone backpack under an old oak tree, suggesting that the Taylors' marriage story was far from over. November 13, 2010 marked exactly 32 days since William and Mary Taylor last saw the civilized world. The official search was suspended, and the hopes of the relatives faded with each morning frost. The Nantahala forest returned to its usual silent state, hiding the secrets of the missing couple under a layer of wet leaves and thick fog. No one expected the silence to be broken on that cloudy Tuesday, and not at all where professional rescuers were working. Around 1 p.m., a group of 4 University of Tennessee students arrived in the Telco Gap area. This is a remote section of forest located 25 kilometers from where Mara's backpack was found. Young people, passionate about landscape photography, were looking for a little-known cascading waterfall they had read about on exploration forums. In pursuit of the perfect shot, they made the fateful decision to leave the designated hiking trail and delve into the thicket, ignoring Forest Service warning signs about difficult terrain and possible landslides. Making their way through dense thickets of rhododendrons and thorny bushes, the group slowly descended into the gorge. The group leader, 20-year-old Michael, stopped to check his compass heading when something unnatural caught his eye near a huge fallen beech tree trunk covered in moss. At first he thought it was a pile of garbage or the remains of a dead animal blown in by the wind. However, when the wind changed direction, the object moved slightly. Michael called to his friends, and they cautiously approached. What they saw was forever etched in their memories. On the damp ground, half sitting and leaning his back against the rotten wood, was a man. It was a man, but his appearance aroused almost animalistic fear. His once high-quality hiking clothes had been reduced to dirty rags, holes revealing his ash-gray skin. He was so emaciated that he resembled a living skeleton covered with parchment. Every rib, every joint protruded, testifying to weeks spent without proper food. The man's wrists, which he clutched tightly to his chest, were marked with deep, inflamed lines. The skin in these places was torn off to the raw flesh, and around the wounds dried blood mixed with dirt. The nature of these injuries left no doubt. These were marks left by ropes or shackles in which the victim had been held for a long time. The man was shivering from the cold, although the temperature that day was relatively moderate for November. But the most terrifying thing was his face. When one of the students dared to ask if he needed help, the stranger raised his head sharply. The tourists took a step back. William Taylor, for it was he, although he could only be recognized from documents, was completely blind. His eyes turned into one big inflamed wound. His eyelids had swollen to an incredible size and were stuck together, and the skin around his eye sockets showed signs of chemical burns. It was covered with blisters and ulcers. It wasn't the result of an infection or a blow. Someone deliberately took away his sight, using a corrosive substance. William did not react to the words. He was in a state of deep psychosis, separated from reality by a wall of pain and darkness. When one of the boys tried to give him water from a canteen, William began to panic and chase away with his unseeing hands, grabbing the saviors by their jackets. His claw-like fingers gripped the material with such force that his knuckles turned white. Only one word emerged from his dry, cracked lips, which he repeated monotonously, like a broken mechanism, breaking into a hoarse whisper and then again into a scream. Jacob! 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 The name echoed through the forest, bouncing off the tree trunks like a sinister spell. The students immediately called an ambulance, trying not to lose sight of the man they had found, but afraid to get too close because of his erratic behavior. While waiting for medics to arrive, Williams tried to stand up, but his legs gave out and he fell back onto the leaves. During this movement, a small object fell out of the torn pocket of his trousers. One of the students picked up the find. It was a crumpled, damp, ungrown piece of shiny paper folded in thirds. After unrolling it, the boy saw a faded advertising brochure. It showed an old-fashioned wooden building against a mountain backdrop with the words Motel Penej written on it. Coziness and silence among the peaks. Below was a map of the route, which looked strangely schematic. The student, who was a local resident and knew the geography of the county well, frowned. He had never heard of such a motel. Moreover, the address printed in small print in the bottom corner of the brochure led nowhere. To an area where, for over 30 years, there had been nothing but abandoned logging roads and dense forest. This object did not exist on any contemporary map, and the paper itself looked as if it had been lying in a pocket for several decades, although it was surprisingly well preserved for something that had survived a month of wandering in the wilderness. William continued to whisper the name Jacob, not realizing that the small piece of paper that fell from his pocket would become the first key to solving the mystery of what really happened to him and his wife. In that cursed forest, the sound of ambulance sirens approaching from the highway shattered the silence. But for William Taylor, the nightmare was not over. A team of doctors fought to stabilize his condition for over 6 hours. In addition to critical dehydration, extreme exhaustion, and numerous infected wounds on their bodies, the medics had to deal with injuries that terrified even experienced surgeons. Ophthalmologist Dr. Alan Peer, after a detailed examination, delivered a devastating verdict. The corneas of both of the patient's eyes were completely destroyed as a result of deep chemical burns. The results of laboratory analyses of facial swabs confirmed the worst fears. It was not accidental contact with household chemicals, nor an unfortunate accident while wandering through the forest. The nature of the tissue damage indicated that a concentrated industrial alkaline solution had been deliberately and methodically poured into the eyes while the victim was firmly immobilized and unable to turn his head. His sight was lost forever. For William, the darkness became a lifelong prison from which there was no escape. This fact turned what was supposed to be an ordinary disappearance case into an investigation into brutal torture and kidnapping. Detectives from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation were not able to conduct their first full interview until 2 days later, on November 15th, when doctors woke William from a medically induced coma. There was a heavy, depressing atmosphere in the room. William lay still. His eyes were hidden under thick bandages, and his voice was so quiet and hoarse that investigators had to lean over the bed to understand his words. He began his confession, which sounded more like the ravings of a madman, but was full of horrifying details. According to William's testimony, the fatal mistake occurred on the second day of their journey. They had run out of drinking water, so he and Mary decided to leave the trail when they heard the sound of water rushing in the gorge. However, instead of a mountain stream, they came across an old, moss-covered building resembling an abandoned hunting cabin. Above the entrance hung a faded wooden sign with the barely visible words, Blackwood Hunting Lodge. They were greeted on the porch by a man of about 50, tall, flexible, with a long gray beard. He introduced himself as Jacob. At first, the stranger seemed to them to be a hospitable hermit. He suggested that the frightened tourists wait out the approaching downpour and replenish their water supplies from his well. William recalled that he and Mary hesitated, but fatigue and thirst overcame caution. As soon as they crossed the threshold of the house, the trap closed. Jacob's hospitality disappeared in a split second. He pulled out a sawed-off old hunting rifle from under the counter and, at gunpoint, forced the couple into the damp earthen basement. The following weeks turned into a real hell. William talked about days when time lost its meaning, Jacob starved them, throwing them only rotten scraps of food as if to dogs, and constantly subjected to psychological pressure, preaching about sin and redemption. He took them outside from time to time, but not to freedom. At gunpoint, he forced them to dig deep holes in the forest. William didn't know exactly what they were for, but he guessed he was digging his own grave. The most terrible moment came a few days before the escape. William was taken upstairs to do some dirty work and was left alone in the main room for a while. His attention was caught by a large map nailed to the wall. It was completely covered with red crosses marked in ink. William realized that these were the burial places of other victims that no one knew about. At that exact moment, Jacob walked in. He said calmly, "You looked where you shouldn't have." Blinding was the punishment for this curiosity. Jacob carried out the sentence in cold blood, while William, tied to a chair, screamed in pain. The escape was only possible thanks to chance. One evening, the kidnapper got drunk on some moonshine and forgot to bolt the heavy oak cellar door. William, guided only by his hearing and touch, made his way outside. Blind, overcome with panic and pain, he wandered through the forest for several days, falling and hurting his feet on stones, until he heard the voices of tourists at a waterfall. But what he told the detectives at the end made their hearts sink. William insisted that Mary was still there, alive. Jacob left her in the basement, finally saying that he had prepared another path of purification for her. The police had to act immediately, but there was one more question from the investigator in the courtroom. How a blind man managed to find his way out of a forest where even experienced rangers can get lost in broad daylight? On November 16, 2010, immediately after the first in-depth interview of William Taylor, a flurry of activity began at Mayon County Police Headquarters. Based on the victim's chaotic but sensually detailed testimony, analysts mapped the area. William mentioned a specific smell of sulfur, which he described as the stench of rotten eggs coming from underground, a constant rush of water, and a periodic metallic grinding sound reminiscent of old mechanisms. All these details combined to point to a specific sector of the Nantahala National Forest, the Slick Rock Creek area. In the 1950s, geological work was carried out here, which explained the release of hydrogen sulfide to the surface, and a little upstream were the ruins of an old water sawmill, whose rusty wheels could still turn under the pressure of the water, making eerie sounds. At 5:45 a.m., a combined group of special forces and agents of the Investigative Bureau set off for the designated square. The operation took place in conditions of absolute secrecy and increased risk. Police believed they were dealing with an armed psychopath named Jacob, holding a woman hostage. The fog that morning was so thick that the officers could barely see the backs of their colleagues walking in front of them. The only point of reference was the roar of the waterfall, which grew louder and louder, drowning out the sound of footsteps on wet leaves. After 2 hours of exhausting march through windfalls, the group emerged onto a small plateau hidden behind a rocky shelf. In the middle of the clearing, surrounded by tall spruce trees, stood a half-ruined wooden hut. She looked like a ghost from the past. A sagging roof, boarded-up windows, and massive doors hanging on homemade hinges. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, and an unnatural silence reigned all around, broken only by the creaking of the old wood. The group commander launched an assault. "Police! Everyone on the ground, hands up!" These commands were given simultaneously with the blow of Taran, who broke down the entrance door. Special forces rushed in, illuminating every corner with tactical flashlights, ready to open fire. But in response, they heard only silence. The hut was empty. No Jacob, no ambush. However, as soon as the dust settled after the assault, investigators realized they had found the exact place William had spoken of. The main room was in disarray, indicating a recent presence of people. On the rough table were open cans of beans covered in mold and several plastic bottles of cloudy water. In a corner, on a pile of old rags, forensic technicians found items that made the experienced officers' hearts clench. It was shreds of light blue fabric and a fleece hat. Mother Mary Taylor would later recognize these things. It was in them that her daughter set off on her hike a month ago. There was also a piece of rope on the floor, identical to the one whose marks remained on William's wrists. But the most sinister finds awaited the police downstairs. In the center of the room, there was a hatch, closed with a heavy metal bolt. After opening it, investigators smelled a heavy odor of damp and human excrement. Descending a rickety ladder, they found themselves in a cramped dugout. The walls were reinforced with rotting poles, on one of which someone had written a single word in large, crooked letters with coal: Jacob. The inscription looked fresh and menacing, like the creator's signature on his work. The basement was arranged like a medieval dungeon. There were massive metal rings driven into the walls, to which chains were attached. Everything looked exactly as William described it in his testimony, a place of pain, fear, and hopelessness. However, when emotions subsided and forensic experts began their arduous work, details began to emerge that did not fit the overall picture. The first strange thing was the arrangement of the chain rings. Were driven into the logs at a height of only 20 centimeters from the threshing floor. This placement would force the prisoner to constantly lie down or crawl, which would be extremely uncomfortable even for a sadistic guard, who would have to bend down to the ground to interact with the victim. But there were no characteristic abrasion marks on the floor that would inevitably appear after a month of such detention. The second, much more serious inconsistency concerned the argument over the basement door. William claimed he managed to escape because his captor forgot to lock the door. However, an examination of the mechanism revealed something else. It was an expensive quarrel that was not forced or sawn through. Its casing was carefully disassembled. The screws holding the freehub body were unscrewed from the inside, and the internal pins were pulled out. On the floor, in a crack between the boards, the investigator found an improvised screwdriver made from a flattened coin and a metal clamp. This discovery led the investigation to a dead end. How could a man blinded by a chemical and in a state of deep shock perform such precise work in complete darkness? Or perhaps the prisoner had the tools and the ability to see until he lost his sight? And if William had the opportunity to dismantle the argument, why did he wait so long to escape? The search for Mary Taylor around the cottage continued until late in the evening. Tracking dogs searched every bush within a 5-kilometer radius in the hope of finding a fresh grave or a woman tied to a tree in the thicket. The forest was clean, though. The dogs did not pick up the scent beyond the threshold of the cottage. It seemed as if Mary Taylor had never left the building, but she wasn't inside either. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, turning the sky blood red, the operation commander stood on the porch of the hut, holding a dismantled log in his hands. They understand that instead of a solution, they have received an even more difficult puzzle, and that the answer to the question of where Mary is may be much more terrifying than just the story of the forest maniac. On November 18, 2010, as tracking dogs and volunteers continued to comb every inch of the area surrounding the cabin in the Scrooge Gorge, the Charlotte investigation team began to untangle a tangle that seemed even darker than the forest thicket. The image of the ideal American family that William Taylor had so carefully constructed during the initial hearings began to crumble before their eyes, exposing the foundations of lies, manipulation, and hidden hatred. Bureau of Investigation detectives gained access to the couple's bank accounts and personal records and discovered the financial abyss into which the Taylor family was falling. According to an auditor's report, more than $120,000 has disappeared from their joint savings accounts over the past 6 months. The money the couple was saving for a new home and their children's future education was transferred to offshore accounts of websites offering risky stock market bets. William Taylor not only lost his job, systematically robbed his family in an attempt to get even, but only deepened his debt. The questioning of people close to Mary Taylor added emotional terror to the financial collapse. On November 19th, detectives met with Sarah Jenkins, a school friend of Mara's. The visibly upset woman testified that 2 weeks before Mara disappeared, she asked her to hide a briefcase with documents at her place. There was a business card from a divorce lawyer and a draft of a domestic violence police report that Mary had never dared to file. Sarah recalled her friend's words. "He changes when he thinks I'm not looking, checks my phone, controls every dollar. Last week I found a GPS locator in my purse. I'm afraid he won't let me go that easily." This conversation took place 3 days before William suggested a romantic trip to the mountains, ostensibly to start over. Now, investigators knew the trip was not an attempt at reconciliation, but a one-way ticket. But the most important piece of evidence that ultimately transformed William from victim to prime suspect came not from witnesses, but from the impartial eye of the camera. The investigation team, realizing that preparing a crime on such a scale required careful planning and the purchase of specialized equipment, confiscated surveillance footage from all hardware and construction materials stores within a 150-kilometer radius of the starting point of the route. Analysts reviewed hundreds of hours of video footage, looking for anything suspicious a month before the incident. The breakthrough came on November 20th at 2 a.m. One sheriff's deputy, reviewing archive footage from the Hardware City store in Sylva, North Carolina, pressed pause. The monitor froze on a frame dated September 28, 2010, exactly 2 weeks before the fateful trip. High-definition footage showed a man pushing a cart through a chemical aisle. He was wearing an inconspicuous gray windbreaker and a baseball cap pulled down tightly over his eyes. His face was partially covered by sunglasses. Even though there was not much artificial lighting in the store, however, his build, characteristic slouch, and the way he kept his hands in his pockets were identical to the physique detectives had seen in William Taylor's wedding photos. The camera recorded the man methodically selecting goods. First, he placed 3 coils of reinforced nylon rope, capable of supporting the weight of an adult, into the cart. Then, he went to the household chemical shelf and took 2 5-liter canisters of industrial drain cleaner. The label, which could be read by zooming in, clearly showed the main ingredient, sodium hydroxide, or caustic soda. It was the same substance that would burn the buyer's eyes a month later. The final chord of this macabre shopping trip was a stop at a log stand. The man looked through the assortment for a long time, checking the weight and durability of various models. Ultimately, he chose a Masterlock padlock with an extended shackle. He took 2 identical pieces. At the checkout, the man paid in cash, avoiding eye contact with the cashier. Detective Harris felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the printout of the video. The padlock on the screen was an exact copy of the one found dismantled in the basement of the forest cabin. The serial numbers of the batches that could be reconstructed from the receipt in the store's database matched. This video footage shattered everything the police knew about the case. If William Taylor was the victim of a mad hermit, why did he buy the tools for his own imprisonment 2 weeks before the crime? Why did he buy chemicals that will eventually rob him of his sight? No kidnapper forces his victim to purchase torture equipment in advance. The conclusion was terrifying and unambiguous. There was no Jacob who accidentally met them in the forest. There was no spontaneous attack. There was only a cold, calculated plan devised by a man determined to destroy his life and that of his wife. William Taylor was not just preparing for murder, he was preparing for a spectacle in which the main role of martyr fell to him. And the scenery was to be the walls of a basement and a corroding arch. There was only one question left that kept investigators awake at night. Where is the instrument that, according to William's script, was to be used to deliver the fatal blows? And where did Mary Taylor's journey really end, since she never left that forest? The answer may have been hidden in details that William, in his pride, may have overlooked. On November 23, 2010, the William Taylor investigation moved into a new digital dimension. While task forces combed the woods, the State Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrime Unit completed a full analysis of electronic media seized from the couple's Charlotte home. The results of this investigation finally shattered the myth of the forest hermit and revealed Jacob's true, much more personal nature. In his report, the department's senior analyst, Agent Mark Sorensen, noted that Meon County's criminal or resident databases for the past 50 years do not show anyone named Jacob who fits the description of the attacker. The composite sketch prepared based on William's testimony turned out to be a compilation of the characteristics of several well-known serial killers whose stories had been widely reported in the press. It was a collective figure, a specter created by the imagination of a man who wanted to be believed. Moreover, the name Jacob was not a random combination of letters. It surfaced in the least expected place, recovered from Mary Taylor's personal email inbox into the deleted folder. Among hundreds of messages about work and home matters, investigators found correspondence with her close friend Sarah, dated August and September 2010. In these emails, Mary often mentioned a man she codenamed Jay. News from September 15th, Mary wrote, "Jacob says he deserves more. I suggest I move to Atlanta with him as soon as the divorce papers are signed. I'm afraid of William's reaction, but Jacob promises to protect me." Investigators quickly established the identity of the mysterious lover. It turned out to be Jacob Miller, a 30-year-old school friend of Mara's, with whom she began an affair amidst their shared marital problems. This fact in itself could only be a motive for murder out of jealousy. However, another discovery turned the case into a ready-made script for a psychological thriller. An analysis of Mary's email logins showed that, starting on September 1st, someone was regularly accessing her emails from the IP address of the Taylor's home computer while Mary was at work. William Taylor not only knew about the betrayal, he read every line, every declaration of love, every escape plan. He knew his rival's name and decided to use that name to create his monster. The legend of Jacob the Forest was not simply an alibi. It was a sick, even theatrical production. William decided that since Mary wanted to go to Jacob, he would arrange a meeting for her, but on his own terms. He created a physical embodiment of his jealousy, a merciless executioner punishing sinners. By attributing all the atrocities to a non-existent maniac bearing the name of his wife's lover, William tried to symbolically destroy his rival himself and the memory of him. But the central question continued to haunt even the experienced FBI profilers assigned to the case. Why did William Taylor go to such a radical step as voluntarily chemically blinding himself? Most criminals who attempt to fake a robbery themselves limit themselves to shallow cuts or minor injuries. The complete, irreversible destruction of sight seemed like an act of true madness or religious fanaticism. The answer came from Dr. Emily Wong, a forensic psychiatrist who observed William in the hospital. In her opinion, she put forward a hypothesis that was striking in its cynical logic. In her opinion, blinding was a form of final defense against justice. "This is not an act of remorse," Dr. Wong wrote in her report to the prosecutor's office. "This is the cold calculation of a sociopath." Williams knew there would be plenty of evidence against him, so he relied on human compassion and the imperfection of the judicial system. His blindness gives him several key advantages. First, he cannot physically go through the process of identifying the attacker from photos, which allows him to avoid the trap of pointing to the wrong person or getting lost in the details of appearance. Second, he assumed that no jury would believe that a man would burn out his eyes for a hoax. His injuries were to become his main alibi, the presumption of innocence branded on his face. Additionally, the psychiatrist suggested that blindness could have been a way to bypass the lie detector. By depriving himself of visual stimuli, William immersed himself in his own imaginary world, where his version of events became the only reality. He didn't see the investigators' reactions, he didn't see the evidence presented to him, and this allowed him to maintain incredible emotional control. On November 24th, Detective Harris decided to test this theory. He entered William's room, holding a folder with email printouts in his hands. The investigator sat down across from the bed and, without raising his voice, said, "We found the real Jacob. William works as a teacher at the same school as Mary. We know you read her letters. We know you stole his name for your play." The suspect's reaction was immediate. William's body, which until then had seemed relaxed and weak, tightened like a steel spring. His hands gripped the bed rail so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But the most terrifying thing was that he stopped pretending to be scared. The mask of sacrifice disappeared from his face. He slowly turned his head towards the detective, and even though his eyes were covered with bandages, Harry felt a heavy, penetrating gaze on him that seemed to see in the dark. William was silent for almost a minute. Then a barely noticeable crooked smile appeared on his lips. He whispered words that had nothing to do with his earlier plea for help. "You're looking for a human, detective, but Jacob is not human. It is sin, and sin cannot be caught. It can only be redeemed in darkness." This sentence became an indirect admission of guilt. However, William still refused to reveal the location of Mira's body. Continuing your game. He was convinced that without a corpse, the blind and mutilated remained untouchable by the law. What he didn't know was that one small detail he thought was safely hidden in his previous life had already fallen into the hands of the police during a second search of his garage before darkness fell. This detail led not to a hut, but to a place where even sunlight rarely reached. On November 25, 2010, the atmosphere in William Taylor's hospital room changed from compassionate to openly hostile. Detectives, armed with evidence from the hardware store, began a new round of questioning. This time they weren't recording the victim's story, but catching the criminal in a lie. Investigator Harris placed a copy of the receipt for the purchase of lye and chains in front of the blind man, slowly and loudly listing each item. He asked why Jacob had William buy these things 2 weeks before the kidnapping, since they had supposedly met by chance. William, previously confident, began to lose control of his legend. He continued to insist on the existence of the maniac, but when the detectives asked him to describe in detail the layout of the torture hut, he made a fatal mistake. He claimed that the basement door was to the left of the entrance, although in reality, the hatch was located exactly in the middle of the room, hidden under the carpet. He described a window in the basement through which light supposedly came in, even though the basement was a blind dugout with no openings to the outside. These inconsistencies proved that William had confused the actual layout of the cottage where he had spent the last month with the false decorations he had imagined for the police. Meanwhile, 60 kilometers from the hospital, the search operation entered its decisive phase. After gaining new information about William's movements, thanks to his phone records, which he briefly turned on in the first few days, the team expanded the search area east of the hut. Their target was the Ray Mine region, a system of abandoned mica quarries and mines that had not been mined since the 1930s. It was a dangerous zone riddled with deep shafts and unstable rockfalls. At 1:30 p.m., the dog unit under the command of Sergeant Davis stopped at the foot of a steep cliff. A bloodhound named Major, who had been confidently leading the group until now, began to worry. He was hovering over a pile of stones that looked unnaturally fresh against the moss-covered slope. The stones were packed tightly together, as if someone was trying to block the entrance to a narrow crevice. Rescuers began to dismantle the infarct manually. After just 20 minutes, they felt a specific, sweet smell of decay seeping through the cracks. As they moved the last great rock away, the flashlight beam revealed a human hand from the darkness. The body was hidden in a shallow natural recess, buried under branches and stones. It was Mary Taylor. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn on her October 12th trip, except for the red jacket that had been found earlier in the cabin. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, although the low temperature in the cave had slowed the process somewhat, preserving traces of violence. An initial on-site examination by a medical examiner revealed the gruesome truth. The woman's skull was fractured at the occipital region. The nature of the injuries indicated a blow with great force, with a blunt, heavy instrument. However, the most important thing was the autopsy report, which was received the next morning, and it concerned determining the time of death. Based on the condition of the tissues and insect activity, pathologists determined that Mary Taylor had died approximately 5 to 7 weeks before her body was found. This meant that she was murdered on October 12th or 13th, on the first or second day of their journey. This fact ultimately destroyed the story of shared slavery. Mary never lived in the hut by the waterfall. She never saw the writing on the walls. She didn't hear Jacob's sermons. She was dead all this time. For a full 32 days, while the search continued and her parents prayed for her return, William Taylor lived in a cabin in the woods all alone. Investigators were horrified to realize the true course of events. This was not a story about the survival of two lovers. It was a chronicle of one man's madness. William killed his wife at the beginning of the tour. He hid the body in the quarry, and then moved to the previously prepared hut. There, alone with the ghosts of his own conscience and the roar of the waterfall, he spent an entire month. He ate canned food prepared for 2 people, slept on a dirty mattress, and methodically prepared the stage for the final act. Psychologists' analysis of the new data showed that the conversations with Jacob that William had reported most likely actually took place. However, these were monologues. He was talking to himself, or worse, to his dead wife, whom, judging by the tread marks around the quarry, he may have been visiting even after the murder. The inscriptions "Redemption" and the name Jakob on the basement walls were not created by a guard, but by the prisoner himself, who was slowly losing touch with reality, trying to play the role of a victim. When William was officially informed on November 26 that the body had been found, he did not ask how she died. He didn't ask where she was found. He simply turned to the wall and asked for a glass of water. His silence rang louder than any admission of guilt. However, among the items found on Mara's body was another piece of evidence that William considered irretrievably lost. This thing not only confirmed his guilt, it revealed what was going through his mind just before the crime and contained the last image his eyes saw before he decided to hide in the darkness forever. On November 28, 2010, when it seemed that all the gruesome discoveries in the Taylor case had been made, Las Nantahala yielded the final and most important piece of evidence. Detective Harris, guided by intuition and strange markings on the map found in William's garage, returned to the area of the cottage. 150 meters north of the building, in the hollow of an old, rotten chestnut tree hidden under a layer of moss and stones, he found an airtight plastic container. It was a hiding place that William Taylor had prepared long before his bloody spectacle began. Inside the container lay a small, leather-bound notebook. It was William's real diary. Not the one where he wrote in charcoal on the basement walls with the police in mind, but the record of his preparations for the crime. The first notes were from August 2010, just after he learned of Jacob Miller's existence. The contents of the diary shocked even the most experienced prosecutors. William described his training in detail. The September 20th entry read, "Today I spent 6 hours blindfolded in the basement. I'm learning to navigate by ear. I count the steps from bed to door. The dark isn't scary. The dark is my only way out. If I can't see, they won't see my lie." William Taylor did not come up with the idea of blinding himself in a moment of desperation. He practiced being blind for months. He prepared his body and mind for life with a disability, considering it an acceptable price to pay for murdering his wife and avoiding suspicion. Based on the diary and expert opinions, investigators reconstructed the final picture of what happened on October 12th. That morning, after arriving at the winding Sturgap parking lot, William and Mary set off on their journey. But William led his wife not along the tourist trail, but across the country to an abandoned quarry where he had prepared a site early on. Around 2 p.m., when they reached the ravine, he fatally hit her in the head with a rock while she was taking pictures of the landscape. Death occurred instantly. He hid the body by covering it with stones and took her red jacket as a trophy. After the murder, William moved into the cottage he had equipped 2 weeks earlier with food supplies and tools. He remained in voluntary confinement for the next 30 days. He starved himself to look extremely exhausted. He inflicted slashes on his wrists, simulating the marks of handcuffs, and wrote the name Jacob on the walls. It was a one-man show, intended for the future audience, the jury. The last act of this drama took place on November 13th. William realized that the time for rescue was approaching. He knew that as a husband, he would be the prime suspect, but as a blind, broken victim of a sadist, he would evoke only sympathy. He injected himself with lidocaine, stolen from his wife's medicine cabinet, to numb the pain, then reached for an industrial bow. He personally poured the corrosive liquid into his eyes, extinguishing the light once and for all. Then, in shock, he walked out onto the path where the tourists found him. William Taylor's trial began on September 5, 2011. The courtroom was bursting at the seams. State's Attorney Elizabeth Stone, in her closing argument, called William the architect of his own hell. As she read excerpts from his diary in which he described his hatred for his wife and her lover, absolute silence reigned in the courtroom. He wasn't shouting the name Jacob because he was calling for help. The prosecutor addressed the jurors, and not because he was afraid. It was his cry of triumph. For him, Jacob became a symbol of his victory. He took Mary, destroyed her future with another man, and believed he had outsmarted justice itself by hiding behind his blindness. The insanity defense has collapsed. The cold calculation recorded on paper was proof that William Taylor acted with full awareness. He was ready to sacrifice his own sight, just to avoid freeing the woman he considered his property. His jealousy was so destructive that he preferred to live in darkness rather than see her happy with someone else. On October 6, 2011, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder with particular cruelty. The judge, announcing the sentence, said, "Mr. Taylor, you tried to use darkness as a shield against the law. Now that darkness will become your prison." William Taylor was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the maximum security Central Prison in Raleigh. There he spends his days in a single cell in a special block. The guards say he never turns on the light, even when he has the right to do so, because it makes no difference to him anyway. He often sits on the edge of the bed, rocking from side to side, and whispers to the void, calling it by the name of his dead wife. The story of the Nantahala forest disappearance has come to an end. Nature is slowly absorbing the remains of the old hut next to the waterfall, erasing the traces of the crime. However, the legend of the blind prisoner and the non-existent murderer Jacob survived in the memory of local residents as a reminder that the most dangerous demons do not lurk in the forest thickets, but deep within the human soul, capable of unimaginable things in the name of revenge. William Taylor got what he wanted. He remained with Mary forever, locked in the eternal night of his own memories, from which there is no return.